"You fed me one warm meal, ma'am. I've been trying to pay it back ever since." That was what he said on the porch when the cottonwoods had gone from green to gold and back to green again. And Clara Whitfield finally understood what her grandmother had told her a long time ago about the way some men keep books that no ledger ever sees. But that comes later. First, there is a September evening in 1887, 12 miles east of Durango, in the San Juan foothills, where the wind runs down the pass carrying the smell of wood smoke and cold water, and a woman stands at her kitchen window watching a stranger stagger up the wagon road with one hand pressed against his side. Clara Whitfield was 31 years old that autumn. She had been a widow for 4 of those years. Her husband Samuel had been a soft-spoken cattle buyer out of Pueblo who caught pneumonia the second winter of their marriage and did not survive the thaw. He had left her 160 acres of good bottom land along Rio Vista Creek, 17 head of cattle, a stove that smoked in the west wind, and a small china cup with violets painted on the rim that she still could not bring herself to put away. She ran the place mostly alone. A neighbor named Elias Beckwith came by on Tuesdays with mail and flour and small kindnesses, and a boy from town, Tomas Rivera, rode out on Saturdays to help mend fence for $2 and a plate of whatever Clara was cooking. Otherwise, the days were her own, and the nights were her own, and she had made a kind of peace with that arrangement, or believed she had. The 4 years since Samuel had gone had not been unkind, exactly. They had been quiet. Clara had learned to shoot a rifle well enough to keep coyotes off the calves. She had learned to butcher a hog and to cure the hams properly in the smokehouse. She had learned to reset a shoe on a plow horse and to read the sky in the North Pass for the kind of weather that came in a hurry. She had learned that a woman living alone on 160 acres could get through a winter if she was careful with the wood and careful with the flour, and if she did not think too much about the second pillow. She had put Samuel's boots away in a chest in the loft after the first year. She had not put the china cup away. She had told herself, more than once, that the china cup was different, though she could not have said, if pressed, what the difference was. It sat on the shelf over the west door, in the shadow, because the west door was where the light came from, and she had wanted the violets on the rim to be seen. In 4 years, she had not once drunk from it. In 4 years, she had not once moved it. She did not know the man on the road. He was tall and thin under a road-worn duster, and he moved like a man who had been walking for longer than his body wished to admit. When he came within 30 yards of the porch, he stopped and lifted his hat, and Clara saw that his face was pale under the trail dust, and his mouth was set against something that hurt him. He did not call out. He waited. Grief does not leave. It just learns to share the house with other things. Clara set down the dish towel and walked out onto the porch and asked him plain what he needed. He said his horse had gone lame 6 miles back, and he had been walking since noon, and he would take water if she could spare it, and shelter for the animal if she had a corner in a barn, and he would be moving on come first light. He said his name was Ethan Calloway. He was 34 years old. He had been a cavalry scout for 6 years and a drifter for 2, and he had a bruised rib from a fall that morning that he did not mention. His duster had been dark blue once and was now the color of trail dust and old rain. His boots were good boots that had been walked hard. He carried nothing on his back except a bedroll and a canvas satchel. And Clara understood, in one clean glance, that a man who had been on the road 2 years and owned only what she was looking at was a man who did not keep what he did not need. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said the barn was open and the water pump was around the side, and if he would sit down on the step and stop swaying, she would bring him a plate. He said no, ma'am. He could not accept a meal from a woman living alone. It would not be right. She said it was not a matter of what was right. It was a matter of a man who would not make it to Durango on empty. She said, "Sit." He sat. She fed him one warm meal that night. Beef stew with carrots and the last of the September potatoes, cornbread with butter, coffee strong enough to hold a spoon upright. He ate slowly and carefully, the way hungry men eat when they do not want to be seen being hungry. He said thank you 3 times, once for the coffee, once for the bread, once at the end for the whole of it. He did not ask her name. He did not ask her history. He tipped his hat and walked out to the barn where she had said he could bed down in the loft, and Clara stood at the kitchen window a long time, watching the lantern in the barn window until it went dark. She locked the kitchen door for the first time in months. Then she unlocked it. Then she locked it again and stood there feeling foolish about the locking, and went to bed. That is what love looks like before it knows it is love. It just quietly locks the door and lies awake, wondering. She rose at first light, expecting the barn to be empty. It was not empty. The stranger was in the barn. He was also on the roof of her feed shed, where a shingle had lifted in the August storms and let the rain in on her winter oats. He had climbed up there without asking, without waking her, without a word, and he was hammering a new shingle down flat with the flat of a stone because he had no proper hammer, and he had already stacked 3 others straight and true. Clara stood in the yard in her shawl and watched him. He came down the ladder when he saw her and touched his hat and said, "Good morning, ma'am," and he said the shingle had been the first thing he could see needed doing, and he had not wanted to wake her, and he hoped she would forgive the presumption. He said he had walked into Durango at 4 in the morning and back by 6, and he had brought her something. He held out a small, paper-wrapped bundle. She opened it on the porch step. Inside was a hammer, a good one, ash handle, forged, head, oiled and clean, and a small paper packet of nails, 3 sizes sorted by hand. And underneath, a folded square of muslin holding 6 ripe pears from the Durango orchards, which had been out of season a full month, and which he must have paid a foolish price for. He said, "I could not sleep on your kindness, ma'am. I have been fed by strangers before. I have never been fed like that." I walked to town to buy back the meal. Clara said, "That is not how meals work." He said, "Ma'am, I know. That is why I brought pears." There was a silence. Then Clara laughed, once. The first real laugh she had laughed since the second summer after Samuel died, and it surprised her so much that she sat down on the porch step and put her face in her hands, and did not know for a moment whether she was laughing or crying. Ethan Calloway said nothing. He set the hammer down on the porch step beside her, tipped his hat, and walked back out to the shed and finished the shingles. That is how it began. Clara set the pears on the sideboard in the kitchen and stood a while looking at them. She had not eaten a pear since the summer before Samuel died. She picked one up, and it was heavier than it looked, and cold from the road, and she put it back down carefully in the muslin, as if she were setting down a thing that could break. And she went out to the yard to draw a second bucket of water for the trough, because she needed her hands to do something. He meant to leave that afternoon. He did not leave that afternoon. She asked him if he would look at the west stove flue that had smoked in the wind for 3 winters, and he said, "Yes, ma'am." And by supper, the stove drew clean for the first time since Samuel was alive. She asked if he could stay one more day to help her get the last of the September cutting in from the north field, and he said, "Yes, ma'am." And the hay was in the loft by Wednesday. One day became 4. 4 became a fortnight. A fortnight became October, and October in Colorado is a thing that does not ask permission, it just arrives with cold in its teeth. And by the time Ethan Calloway had finished patching the south fence line where a bull had gone through in May, the aspens up the ridge had gone the color of new copper, and the mornings had frost on them. The work he did that first month, Clara later thought, was of 3 different kinds. and she had never in her life met a man who understood the difference between them so clearly without being taught. There was the strong work, the lifting, the hauling, the driving of fence posts into ground gone hard with the first frosts, the swing of the maul at the woodpile until the stack against the north wall of the barn was 6 feet deep and neat. Clara would look out sometimes in the middle of the afternoon and see him at the woodpile with his coat off in the cold and his shirt sleeves rolled and steam coming off his back. And she would go back to what she was doing and not trust herself to keep looking. There was the quiet work, the mending of a bridle in the barn loft by lantern light, the oiling of the door hinges she had not realized creaked until they stopped creaking, the straightening of a bent nail in the pump handle so that the pump no longer bit her palm when she drew water. He did these things in a silence that was not the silence of a man who did not know what to say. It was the silence of a man who preferred to say things with his hands. And then there was the third kind, which Clara did not have a name for until later. One evening in the middle of October, she came out onto the porch at dusk to bring in a basket of October beans she had left drying on the rail. And she found that Ethan had built, on the east side of the kitchen, in the plain, south-facing wall that had never had a window in it, the rough beginning of a new window frame. He had not asked. He had cut the studs and set the header and squared the opening, and he was standing back looking at it with his hat in his hand. And when he heard her step, he turned and said, "Mom, I know I did not ask. I saw that all your morning light comes in through the west door, and it does not come in until noon, and I thought, this wall is the wall the sun comes over first. I thought you might like to have your coffee in the morning light. I will patch it back if I have overstepped." Clara stood in the doorway with the basket of beans in her arms and looked at the framed opening in her wall through which she could see, now, the pink beginning of the sky over the San Juan range. She said, "Ethan, do not patch it back." He said, "Ma'am." She said, "Finish it." He finished it the next day. He put in the sash himself and he set the glass, and by that evening, Clara Whitfield had, for the first time in her adult life, an east-facing kitchen window through which the sun of a Colorado morning could enter her house at 6 o'clock and warm the corner where she took her coffee. She did not sleep well that night either, but it was a different kind of not sleeping. Clara did not know what to call the arrangement. Neither, it seemed, did Ethan. He slept in the barn loft. He took his meals on the porch step, never at the table, until one November evening when it was too cold to eat outside, and Clara said plainly, "Come in." And he came in and sat at the table across from her, and they ate in a silence that had grown, over the weeks, comfortable. Elias Beckwith rode out that Tuesday with the flour and the mail and saw the stranger on the roof of the smokehouse patching a soft spot in the boards. And Elias watched him a long moment and then rode up to the porch, where Clara was on the step shelling October beans into a bowl. Elias Beckwith was a good man. He was 46, a widower himself, quiet, careful with his words. He had been coming by on Tuesdays for 2.5 years, and Clara had known for at least a year that he had been building up the courage to say something and had never quite managed it. And she had been grateful for the not saying, because saying would have required an answer she did not have. Elias said, "Clara, who is that man on your smokehouse?" Clara said, "That is Ethan Calloway. His horse went lame. He has been helping me get ready for winter." Elias said, "Has he now?" Clara said, "Yes." Elias looked at the smokehouse a long while. Then he looked at Clara. Then he said, "Clara, I have been meaning to say something to you for some time. I have never quite known how. I think a man ought to speak when he means to speak. So I'm going to speak now, and I hope you will hear me kindly. I think you are the best woman in this valley. I have thought so for a long time. If there is any world in which you might one day be willing to consider a life with me, I would be honored to know it. And if there is not, I will still ride out on Tuesdays with the flour. Clara set down the bowl of beans. Elias said, "Take your time. I did not come today to press you. I came to say it, so that if the answer is no, you will not one day wonder whether the offer was there. It was there. It is there." He touched his hat and rode back to town without waiting for a reply. Clara sat on the porch step a long time after he left. The bowl of beans went cold in her lap. She thought of Elias, who was 46 and steady and known to her, and whose farm ran along the east side of Rio Vista Creek and made 240 acres if joined with hers, and whose late wife Margaret she had liked well when Margaret was alive. She thought of the sensible life. And then she thought of the shingles that had been stacked straight and true on her feed shed on a morning she had not asked for, and of the pears that had cost a foolish price, and of the east-facing window that had not been asked either. And she thought, sensible is a good word. It is not the only word. Ethan Calloway came down off the smokehouse roof at dusk and washed at the pump, and did not ask what Elias had said, and Clara did not tell him. And they ate that night at the table in the same comfortable silence, except that the silence was no longer entirely comfortable. Some silences are shared. Some silences are two people carrying different sentences. The town chorus began the next Sunday. That is what Clara later called it, in her own head, though she never said the phrase out loud. Mrs. Delphine Ortega at the general store said, "So, Clara, is it true you have a hired man out there this winter? And how nice for you, dear, and how convenient." The Reverend Whitcomb said from the pulpit that autumn was a season for gathering in what the summer had grown, and he looked, Clara was almost sure he looked, directly at her. Tomas Rivera, who was 17 and observant, mentioned on Saturday while they were mending fence that Ethan had asked him 3 separate questions about the price of land along the creek and the going rate for a good draft team. And Tomas thought Clara ought to know. And old Mrs. Havelock, who had been the schoolmistress in Durango for 41 years and who missed nothing, stopped Clara on the church steps the following Sunday and said, "Dear, a man who mends another man's fence in October is not a drifter. A drifter cuts a switch and moves on. You would do well to notice." Clara noticed. Even Elias Beckwith, on the Tuesday after his speech, brought the flour and the mail and said gently, "Clara, I am not going to ask a second time, but I would ask you this. Do you know what you have there?" And Clara said, "I do not entirely know, Elias." And Elias said, "Well, when you do know, one way or the other, would you tell me?" And Clara said, "I will tell you." She meant it. That night, she went out to the barn. Ethan was in the loft. There was a lantern burning. He was mending a bridle by its light, and he looked up when she climbed the ladder, and he set the bridle down carefully, and he waited. Clara said, "Ethan Calloway, I need to ask you a question." He said, "Ma'am." She said, "Do not ma'am me tonight." He said, "Clara." She said, "Why are you still here?" He set the bridle in his lap. He looked at his hands a long moment. His hands were the hands of a man who had done hard work for a long time and not spoken often about the doing of it. He said, "Clara, I have never told you why I stopped drifting. I owe you the telling. My mother raised me alone in a soddy west of Cheyenne. Her name was Ruth Calloway. She was 38 years old when she died. She died when I was 19, in March of 1872, of a fever the doctor said was nothing. She had fed a stranger the week before, a boy of maybe 14, who had come out of the snow half dead, and she had given him her half of the last of the winter stores. And she took sick 3 days after, and I have always suspected but never known whether the fever came in with him. I do not blame him. She would not have blamed him. But I have carried, since I was 19, a debt to strangers who feed other people's children. That is the plain fact of it." He paused. He looked up. He said, "I have been drifting for 15 years, Clara. I have not stayed anywhere longer than a season. Every time a woman fed me at her back door, I fixed one thing on her place before I left. A gate, a latch, a rotten step. I have never told anyone that. I did not think it was worth the telling. It was just the way I settled the account inside my own head, so I could keep moving. When you fed me that first night, I meant to leave in the morning. Then I saw the shingle on your shed. Then I saw the flue. Then I saw the fence in the south pasture where a bull had gone through in May and not been mended right. And I thought, if I stay one more day, I can leave her better than I found her. And then it was a week. And then it was a month. And now it is November. And I do not know how to leave you without leaving something undone. And I do not know how to stay without asking you a question I have not earned the right to ask." Clara said, "Ethan?" He said, "Clara, I am not Elias Beckwith. I do not have a farm and 46 years of standing in this valley. I have a lame horse and a strong back and a debt I cannot pay to a woman who has been in the ground 15 years. I do not have a right to ask you anything. But if you tell me to go, I will go tonight, before I do more damage. And if you tell me to stay, I will stay. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to pay back the one warm meal. And I know that is not how meals work. I know." Clara stood in the lantern light in the barn loft and looked at him a long time. Outside, the wind ran down the pass the way it had that first September evening, carrying the smell of wood smoke and cold water. Somewhere out toward the north pasture, a cow bawled once and went quiet. She thought, absurdly, of the china cup with the violets on the rim, sitting on the shelf above the new east window where the morning light would touch it first. She said, "Come down to the fence line in the morning, the south one where the bull went through. There is something I want to say to you, and I want to say it standing on the line." He said, "Yes." She climbed back down the ladder. She slept badly. She rose before dawn. She walked out through the frost in her heaviest shawl to the south fence line where a young cottonwood stood beside the corner post, and Ethan Calloway was already there, hat off, hands at his sides. The sky over the San Juan Range was the pale color of the inside of a shell. The frost on the top rail of the fence caught the first of the light and turned it silver. Clara said, "Ethan, my husband Samuel died in the second winter of our marriage. I loved him. I have loved him for 4 years since he has been in the ground. I did not think I would love anyone again. I made peace with not loving anyone again. It was not the worst kind of peace, but it was the peace of a house with all the windows on one side. You built me an east window. You did not ask permission. You just built it. And this morning, the light came in, and I could not pretend anymore that I had not noticed the light." She said, "Ethan Calloway, I am not asking you to leave. I am asking you to stay. I am asking you to stop sleeping in the loft. I am asking you to marry me before the ground freezes hard, because I do not intend to spend another winter with all the windows on one side." He did not speak for a long moment. Then he took her hand across the fence line, not over it, but across it, palm to palm, the way a man reaches for something he has been afraid to want. He said, "Clara, I am going to say yes, but I want to say it 3 times, so you cannot mistake me. Yes, yes, yes." They were married the second Saturday of November in the small church in Durango by Reverend Whitcomb, who did not look at anyone in particular this time. Elias Beckwith sat in the 3rd row on the aisle. He had come in his good black coat, and he had brought, as a wedding gift, a hand-planed cradle he had made in his own barn over the 2 weeks between his speech on her porch and her wedding day. And he had wrapped it in a horse blanket and set it in the back of the wagon and driven it over that morning without saying a word about what it was for. When Clara walked past him on Ethan's arm after the ceremony, Elias stood. And he took off his hat, and he said, Clara, I am glad. And he said it as a man who meant it, and who had also, in those 2 weeks, done the harder work of meaning it. Clara reached out and took his hand and said, Elias, thank you for the flower. And Elias said, I will still bring it, if you will still take it. And Ethan Calloway, standing there in a borrowed coat, said quietly, We will still take it, sir, and it will be a kindness. And Elias nodded once and set his hat back on and rode home to his own place, and the next Tuesday he came with the flower and the mail, exactly as before, and the Tuesday after that, and the Tuesday after that. And this is the small and quiet way in which the men of that valley loved the women of that valley, whether they had won them or lost them. Mrs. Delphine Ortega at the general store said, Well, I always thought so. Tomas Rivera said, I am glad, ma'am. Old Mrs. Havelock said only, Good, and went back to her mending. The Reverend Whitcomb said from the pulpit the following Sunday that autumn had done its gathering. The winter that came was a hard one. In January, the snow drifted 6 feet against the north side of the barn, and Ethan had to dig the milk cow out of a drift with his hands. In February, a calf was born early, and Clara sat up with it in the kitchen on a bed of straw for 2 nights running, and it lived. And in the second week of February, on a still evening when the stove drew clean and the new east window was black with the winter dark, Clara set down her mending and said, Ethan, I have not told you something. I lost a child in the first year with Samuel, a little girl born too early in the spring. She lived 4 days. I have not spoken her name aloud since we buried her. Her name was Ruth. I did not know until you told me your mother's name that I had not chosen it by accident. I think I chose it because it was a good name for a girl who would have to be brave. Ethan Calloway put down the harness he was oiling and came across the kitchen and knelt on the floor beside her chair and did not say anything for a long time. And then he said, Clara, my mother would have liked to know there was a girl in this world named for her, even for 4 days. Thank you for the telling. In March, a letter came from Cheyenne, from a woman Ethan had not seen in 11 years, an aunt he had thought dead, who had heard through a cousin that he had married and settled, and who wanted, if he would have her, to come and meet his wife. Ethan read the letter twice and set it on the table and looked at Clara for a long while. Clara said, Ethan, write her. Tell her to come in April, when the road is passable. Tell her she has family here. He wrote the letter that night, and in April, when the aspens along the ridge broke into that first pale green that Colorado gives you as an apology for winter, and the creek ran high and clear over the smooth stones by the south fence, Clara Whitfield Calloway stood on her porch in the early morning and watched her husband walk out across the yard to the shed with his hammer in his hand. And she thought of the September evening he had first come up that road with one hand pressed against his side. And she thought of the pears he had walked 12 miles into Durango to buy at a foolish price. And she thought of what he had said 3 times at the fence line. And she thought of Elias Beckwith and his flower. And she thought of a small china cup with violets on the rim, now sitting in the morning light on a shelf above a window that had not existed the September before. And she thought of her grandmother, long dead now, who had once told her that the men worth having were the men who kept books that no ledger ever saw, and paid their debts in shingles and in stoves that no longer smoked, and in east-facing windows built without permission. Ethan came back to the porch at mid-morning and set his hammer on the step and touched the brim of his hat the way he had that first September, and said, mostly to himself, mostly to the mountain, "You fed me one warm meal, ma'am. I've been trying to pay it back ever since." Clara heard him. She did not say anything. She only reached across and put her hand on his hand on the porch rail, and they stood there a while in the April light. That is what love looks like when it doesn't announce itself. It just quietly faces east. And if you are watching this tonight, wherever you are, in whatever country you happen to be, I want you to hear this. There will come a stranger up your road one evening when the light is failing and the cottonwoods have gone gold. He will not look like the man you thought you were waiting for. He will look tired. He will look uncertain. He will not have a farm or 46 years of standing in your valley. He will only have a strong back and a debt he cannot name, and the simple decency to see a shingle that needs mending and mend it without being asked. Feed him. Feed him one warm meal. Watch what he does in the morning. Because the men and women worth having in this life are not the ones who make grand declarations at your door. They are the ones who walk 12 miles into town in the cold before you are awake, and come back with a hammer and a packet of nails and 6 pears that were out of season, because they could not sleep on your kindness. And when you find that person, do not make them ask twice. Build them a chair at your table. Cut a window in the east wall of your life. Let the light in. Thank you for sitting with this story tonight. Thank you for letting me tell it to you. If it warmed something in you, that is Clara and Ethan's doing, not mine. I only carried it here. Until next time, keep riding. And if this one found its way into your heart, ride with me next into the story of the Colorado widower who found a lost child in his hayfield in the first snow of December, and what he said to her mother when he brought her home 3 days later, because that one is a story too, and it is waiting.